They laughed the first time they saw it. A low, earth-colored shape crouched behind the new cabin, half swallowed by the prairie soil, its roof barely rising above the tall grass. From a distance, it looked less like a barn and more like a wound in the land, as if the ground itself had tried, and failed, to heal over it. "That's not a barn," one settler snorted, leaning on his saddle. "That's a grave." Mary Caldwell heard them all. She heard the laughter carried by the wind. She heard the whispers at the general store. She heard the way her name was spoken with a smile that wasn't kind, the mail-order bride who buried her barn. Mary said nothing. She rarely did. She had arrived in Wyoming territory with one trunk, one faded photograph of a man she'd married by letter, and a quiet determination shaped by years of loss. Her husband, Thomas, had died just 6 months after her arrival, caught under a wagon axle during a spring run. The prairie had barely learned her name before it tried to take everything from her. But Mary stayed. When the settlers rebuilt their stables, tall, proud wooden barns with bright red paint, Mary dug. She studied the land the way some people studied scripture. She noticed how the wind cut across the plains without mercy. She watched how snow piled and pressed, how rain raced downhill in sudden floods. And she remembered her father, back east, who had once told her, "The earth is stronger than wood, if you're humble enough to trust it." So Mary built her barn low. She dug into the slope behind her cabin, packed the walls with sod and stone, reinforced the beams with salvaged timber, and covered the roof with earth thick enough to grow grass. It took months. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. She worked alone, except for the old mule and 2 milk cows she hoped to keep alive through winter. The settlers laughed harder as the barn disappeared into the ground. "Afraid of the wind, little lady? Planning to bury your livestock early? Storm won't care how clever you think you are." Mary smiled politely. She kept digging. When winter came early that year, it came angry. The sky darkened in the afternoon, the clouds rolling in like a wall. By nightfall, the wind screamed. An animal sound that rattled bones and split the air. Snow fell sideways, thick and blinding. Temperatures dropped so fast that breath froze in beards and lashes. By midnight, the storm had teeth. Barn doors tore from hinges. Roofs lifted like paper. The proud red stables that had stood tall against the horizon collapsed one by one, crushed by wind or buried under drifts so heavy they broke the beams. Animals panicked. Horses screamed. Cows broke tethers. Men ran into the storm and vanished, calling names that the wind swallowed whole. Inside her cabin, Mary listened. She prayed. Then she pulled on her coat. She opened the door and stepped into the white fury, leaning into the wind, making her way to the low hill behind her house. She opened the heavy door to her buried barn, warm air rushing out like a living thing. Her animals were calm inside, sheltered by earth and stone. Mary didn't close the door. She lit a lantern and hung it by the entrance. And she waited. It wasn't long before she heard it, footsteps, frantic and uneven. Then voices. A man appeared through the snow, face raw with cold, carrying a limp lamb. "Mary," he shouted, disbelief in his voice. "Your barn. Bring it inside," she said, steady and loud over the wind. Then another man came. And another. Horses followed, eyes wild. Cows. Chickens wrapped in coats. Children clinging to their fathers' legs. One by one, the settlers poured into the earth-buried barn they had mocked. Mary made room for all of them. She passed out blankets. She brewed what little coffee she had left. She sat with a woman who was shaking too hard to speak and wrapped her hands around hers until the trembling slowed. All night, the storm raged. And all night, Mary gave. By morning, the wind died the way it had come, suddenly, leaving behind a broken world. The settlers stepped outside into silence. Across the plains, the damage was clear. Barns flattened. Fences gone. Livestock lost to cold and fear. The land looked scoured, as if punished. Only one barn stood whole. Mary's. No one laughed now. They stood in the snow, hats off, breath quiet, looking at the woman who had saved not just animals, but families, livelihoods, and lives. A man stepped forward. It was the same one who had called her barn a grave. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "You could have shut the door." Mary looked at the horizon, then back at the people gathered around her barn. "I knew what it felt like," she said, "to arrive with nothing. I knew what it felt like to lose everything you thought would hold." Her voice trembled, just once. "I didn't want anyone else to feel that alone." In the weeks that followed, something changed. The settlers rebuilt, but differently this time. Lower. Smarter. Together. They helped Mary expand her barn, turning it into a shared shelter for future storms. Children brought her flowers. Neighbors left supplies without saying a word. And when spring came, green and gentle, grass grew thick over the buried barn, as if the land itself had chosen to protect it. Mary never said "I told you so." She didn't need to. Because the prairie had spoken, and it had spoken in her favor. And those who once laughed learned something that winter. That strength doesn't always stand tall. Wisdom doesn't always shout. And sometimes the safest place in a storm is built by someone quiet enough to listen first, and kind enough to leave the door open.